I'm not an expert on tourism, but I have done quite a lot of work on the circular economy. So what I'm going to try to set out to you today is some of the principles around circular economy, and then leave it to people who are much more expert than me in tourism to see how they might be applied in Mallorca and indeed more widely. I was very happy to be following Daniel Weil's presentation this morning because, as you will notice, I'm not a young man, and it is more years than I can remember of coming to these conferences and hearing people say that this is urgent, and then nothing happens. Nothing happens. You will have seen that many of the dates on the publications that Daniel was putting up there were 2011, 2012. And in 2011, 2012, people were saying exactly the same, that this is urgent, that this is existential for human civilization. And it is remarkable that we as intelligent people, we go on with those messages behaving exactly as we did before. So I hope that at some point things will change. In the many international meetings that there now are, where this message is being given with increasing urgency, it's obviously difficult, it's obviously complicated, and one of the things that Daniel didn't say, but which is very obvious to me, is that the way we do things now is one of the reasons it's so difficult to change is because it is so comfortable and it's so pleasurable to go on living, if we're members of the global middle class, in the way that we currently do. And building an effective politics for change that persuades the members of the global middle class in their own interests, but above all in the interests of their children, that they need to change, is a task that is certainly beyond me as a mere academic, but it is an absolutely fundamental task for the future. And the circular economy is a very important part of that task, and tourism is a very important part of the circular economy, or needs to be, because it is, as Daniel said, a very fast-growing sector. It is a very environmentally intensive sector, despite being one of the so-called service industries, with very considerable impacts through construction. I'm examining a PhD in Sweden on Saturday on the consumption patterns of the Swedish population, and the number one sector for the Swedish population consumption impacts is construction. And of course, tourism is absolutely critical in terms of construction. It builds huge amounts of stuff, which is almost by definition surplus to people's main residence. So we're building lots and lots of things out of steel and concrete, which are very carbon intensive, to enable people obviously to leave home and to create 1, 2, 3, 4 places of residence effectively around the world. So any notion that tourism doesn't have a big role to play in circular economy seems to me to be quite wrong. 40% of the emissions in aviation come from tourism, and as we know, aviation is really one of the hard to decarbonize sectors. So that is significant, and then there are lots of other impacts as well. I wrote a paper for the OECD earlier this year, which is just being finalized for publication, about the circular economy. And not surprisingly, I suppose, there are lots of different definitions, and people sometimes mean different things by it. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which Daniel referenced in his talk, and which has been absolutely fundamental in bringing the idea of the circular economy up the public agenda, that's its definition. It talks about industrial systems, a bit misleadingly really, because Tourism isn't really an industrial system, and yet it's clearly very relevant to the circular economy. And then it's talking about the phrase that Daniel stressed, it's regenerative by intention and design, and that is the single aspect that is missing from the linear economy, the design for the reuse, repurposing of materials, elimination of waste, and the creation of new business models. And we'll come on to some of the conditions through which that might happen. And I'm really glad that Marta's put me in this session on public administration, because public administration has an absolutely critical role to play in the creation of a circular economy. It simply will not happen through the normal forces of the market, although obviously the normal forces of the market are going to be very important in terms of delivering it within the right framework. You can imagine when academics got their teeth into the circular economy, they defined it in all sorts of different ways, and this reference to this Kircher paper identifies 114 different definitions of circular economy. I apologize on behalf of my academic colleagues for this chaos and confusion. And you can see that in trying to put all those definitions together, which is what this second definition does, you can see it gets pretty complicated and difficult. So I've tried to make it a little simpler, not so much with that synthesis. So it has low environmental impacts, and that's absolutely critical. It makes good use of natural resources. So we're talking here about resource efficiency, resource productivity. It prevents waste, doesn't recycle waste, it prevents waste. And that is the big difference between circular economy thinking and current waste management thinking, as expressed, for example, in the Waste Framework Directive of the European Union, which is overwhelmingly focused on recycling, although those of you who know the waste hierarchy in the Waste Framework Directive will know that the top of the waste hierarchy is waste prevention. And that's where the circular economy is aimed, and therefore minimal end-of-life disposal of materials. Daniel did me the favor of showing this next slide, this lovely butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which has kind of become its signature category. We haven't time to go through the three principles up there, but they are critical and they're worth thinking about, because they are about as different in design and intent as our current linear economy is, as it is possible to be. So then I want to move on to considering, why doesn't this happen? Nature does it. Why can't humans? And this slide is the most useful one I know that identifies the barriers to a circular economy. And the ones within the little red boxes at the bottom are the barriers that are internal to organizations. Why organizations? And by organizations, I principally mean companies, firms. So the big tourism companies that Daniel was referring to earlier. Why don't they go circular? And if there are any executives from those companies there, I guarantee that if they look down those categories there, they will recognize that that's why they don't do it. Incentives to invest, access to capital, high cost and low return on investment, lack of targets and benchmarks, business and commercial models. You can read them for yourself. In the box above that, we have the role of government. Some of these barriers within businesses, the business can sort out for itself. So things to do with business culture, things to do with measuring the right things, monitoring the right things, managing the right things. These are standard business practices, and businesses don't currently do it because they're not used to doing it, it's new for them, they can't be bothered. They've got other things to do. But in the boxes above, it's what governments need to do in order for businesses to start paying attention to these kinds of issues. And only governments can change the pricing structures. One of my academic subjects is environmental taxation, and environmental taxation is something that is routinely recommended by every environmental economist I have ever come across, and it is just as routinely not implemented by politicians because of the difficulties. And I was just talking to Daniel in the break about Mallorca's love and hate affair with eco-taxes. I remember when you introduced eco-taxes in the 1990s unsuccessfully, and they were then withdrawn, as I understand, and I remember the controversy that was there. At the time, I thought to myself, why would you not want to introduce eco-taxes? You're overrun with tourists. You have far more tourists than actually you can comfortably cope with, and eco-taxes is the obvious way to bring in more money to your economy in order to make Mallorca a more beautiful place, so that the demand from tourists is going to be sustained. And anyway, but I know that eco-taxes are difficult because I've studied them in many different countries, and I'm hoping we'll hear something about that in the conference today. So there we go, the barriers. The nice thing about this diagram, and I recommend it to you, it's a wonderful publication by these AMEC and BioIS. It was one of the major pieces of work that was commissioned by the European Commission when they were working on their first circular economy package. And the nice thing about and this is the diagram on the right, is that there are solutions to these barriers. We actually know what to do. That's not the same thing as saying that doing it is easy. Clearly, doing things differently is always difficult. You have to be innovative. But there are many businesses now that are addressing the red box and moving towards the green box. And I'm afraid there are far fewer governments that are systematically going through the drivers there in order to make the business landscape much more friendly and accommodating for circular economy principles. So here's a summary that comes from this OECD paper that I was talking about. There's a big literature on this. We understand what these barriers and drivers are. They can be internal or external, as I've said. The economic barriers are considerable. It is simply unreasonable to expect individual businesses to become completely circular and stay in business under the current economic landscape, because it is really difficult. Some of the things they need to do are expensive, and the non-circular alternatives are cheap, too cheap, because so many of the costs, environmental and otherwise, are externalized to other members of society, and particularly, of course, to future generations. So governments have to sort that out. There are institutional issues and problems, such as the definitions of waste at the European level. And of course, there are technological and infrastructural factors. For the last 250 years, since the Industrial Revolution, we've been building infrastructures for linear economies, and clearly it's going to take time to replace those infrastructures in order to make economies more circular. Daniel mentioned one specific example, transport. Transport, of course, requires huge infrastructure, and the infrastructure we need for active urban transport, where the great majority of people cycle, walk, or take convenient public transport, those kinds of infrastructures are very different to the kind of car mobility, car-dependent mobility, that we currently have at the moment. Knowledge and organizational practices, I've already mentioned. Existence of pre-existing relationships, all the way up supply chains. Most companies, big companies, they have enormously extended supply chains. Many of them haven't a clue what the material implications are of those supply chains. Again, we're beginning to see those companies that are starting to move in this direction, finding that actually if they manage their supply chains differently, then they can get extra value out of those supply chains because they get a much higher level of knowledge, awareness, and relationship with their fellow companies. Habits and cultural factors are important. So, when we did work on resource efficiency for a European Framework 7 project called Policies for a Resource Efficient Europe, poll-free, if you published a lot of stuff, and you can find, if you were to Google poll-free, you'd call that up. We kind of moved away from the term barriers, because barriers implies that you've got these individual little roadblocks that you can take them away and then you can go along happily on your path. It was much more like a web of constraints. It was much more like being stuck in a spider's web, a really sticky, difficult, constraining web of factors, institutions, habits, norms, cultures that are much more difficult to break free of. And again, public administrations have an absolutely crucial role to play in that. So if I come on to policies for a circular economy, it's no accident that I've put regulatory frameworks and instruments up there because I think they're really important. Fascinating publication from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation toolkit, delivering the circular economy, a toolkit for policymakers. And there we've got a whole range of possible instruments. None of these are outlandish. They all exist in some places, and where they have been well implemented, they have been enormously successful. What they haven't yet done is sufficiently incentivized design for circularity, design to keep materials in the economy, design to prevent waste. If you look at them, the great majority of them is how you manage waste at the end of its life. Well, that's obviously important. Countries that don't manage their waste properly are in a terrible state, and there are far too many of them around the world. But that's not circular economy. Circular economy is designed to prevent waste. A very important set of instruments there is beyond regulation and the fiscal frameworks, landfill taxes, deposit refund schemes, taxes on virgin materials, revenues from taxes may provide resources for environmental conservation. Another thing I was talking to Daniel about in the break is, what do you do with the revenues for your eco-tax? And he was very interesting about that. I think, as he said in the talk, it would probably be useful to have a little more transparency about how those monies are spent, because if the people of Mallorca became better aware of how these taxes were actually contributing to the quality of the island, they might be more willing to not only maintain them, but see them increased. But it's absolutely unrealistic to expect businesses to become circular if the linear economy remains cheaper and more profitable. You might as well expect water to flow uphill. It doesn't happen, and it cannot happen. And I'm sitting on the Green Innovation Policy Commission. I direct the Green Innovation Policy Commission at UCL in the UK. And all the businesses we have on that commission, it's a business-led commission, led by a former Secretary General of our Confederation of British Industry, and all of them say, for God's sake, government, give us some incentives, give us the taxes on the bad stuff, so that we who want to do the good stuff can start making some money. Because at the moment, they can't. So there we go, and then obviously we've got education, information, and awareness, which is really important. And then we come to something which, again, drives me crazy, that we make so little progress on public procurement and infrastructure. I remember when the UK launched its Sustainable Development Strategy in 2005. It seems a long time ago now. We had the Prime Minister was Tony Blair, whom some of you may remember, and he turned up And I mean, this was a great coup because prime ministers normally didn't bother with something as unimportant as sustainable development. I mean, come on. But anyway, he turned up and we were all very pleased. We thought, wow, this is fantastic. And he made one commitment. His only commitment was that the UK was going to sort out green public procurement. And we thought, well, that's kind of interesting because that is actually something that he could do. He spends 20% of the nation's GDP. And if that 20% of the nation's GDP was spent in a way to stimulate markets for the green and circular economy, well, we'd be halfway there. Well, unfortunately, like so often with politicians, it was blah, 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 and we're still waiting 15 years later in order to have a real green public procurement strategy. So I commend it to your public administrations in Mallorca. So you can read the rest of that slide. In summary, there's no one-size-fits-all policy mix. The only thing that you can say about policy that is absolutely essential if these businesses are going to move in this direction is that it has to be coherent. The different bits of government have to be moving in the same direction. Otherwise, businesses just get confused. They get conflicting signals and messages, and they haven't a clue what's going on. And that is normally what happens in the UK, probably normally what happens in Mallorca, though I don't know enough about the detail to be able to be sure. So it's got to be coherent, it's got to be consistent. It's no good imagining you can deliver this in 5 years. This has to last several electoral cycles. And the politicians have to make it clear on all party sides that that is the direction of travel. And it's got to be credible. They've got to, when they promise stuff, businesses have to believe, yeah, that's going to happen. If they say there will be a carbon tax of 50 euros a ton by 2025, businesses have to believe that. If they believe that, their investments will be quite different than they are today. So that's the summary of that. It's also really important to take account of insights from behavioral economics. I'm not going to go through those in any detail because I'm probably outstaying my welcome here. But the thing to remember is, and I sometimes get a bit worried about the way in which circular economy kind of is becoming a bit of an ideology. Circular economy is not an end in itself. Circular economy is there, and the idea is there to deliver environmental and resource benefits. And we have to be very careful that environmental and resource benefits are what we're going to get. It's plausible that a circular economy will reduce virgin material extraction and will reduce associated environmental impacts, but we can't take that for granted. We have to do our life cycle analysis. We have to study that. We have to be sure that that's going to be the case. There are many cases that I know of where recycling is actually counterproductive environmentally. You use more energy and you produce more pollution through recycling than you do by other means of disposal, like incineration. We have to be clear about that. And with apologies to my friend from Zero Waste Scotland, zero waste is most unlikely to be environmentally beneficial. It's a great political slogan, and it's very good to show the direction of travel, but there will be some things that, because of the second law of thermodynamics, which was also mentioned in the first speech, will not be beneficial. There's a lovely publication by Material Economics which shows the CO2 gains which could be expected from greater circularity, from greater resource efficiency. A lot of those are related to construction, which is obviously fundamental to tourism. So I'll leave you with that reference to follow up if you wish later. Obviously, as an economist, one of the main things I'm interested in, and which people often ask, is what will happen to the macroeconomy if we go circular? Will GDP go down? Will it go up the same amount? Will it go up faster? The true answer to that is we don't know. But all the evidence from macroeconomic models And macroeconomic models are far from perfect, but all the evidence from them is that macroeconomics show that you would get a small GDP benefit from becoming more resource efficient in an intelligent way. I'm going to move on to the conclusions. So there's no common understanding of the circular economy concept, but most of us kind of have an intuitive feel of what it's all about. Its early focus on resources and environment has been broadened to include economic and social objectives, and sometimes I don't find that altogether helpful because the delivery of the social and economic objectives of the circular economy depends crucially on the detail of resource prices, policy implementation, technology innovation, and labor market conditions. And I can imagine a certain use of the environment and its resources which has much greater or lesser levels of income inequality, for example, and this was something that Daniel also mentioned in his talk. And I don't like inequality any more than he does, but I think it's important to recognize the different purposes of different policies. It's quite clear to me that most attractive tourist destinations these days are becoming degraded, and they're becoming degraded because the people who manage them have put too much attention on quantity and not enough attention on quality, and they will probably need to increase their prices, and they will probably need to limit tourist numbers so that you have fewer tourists, perhaps staying for longer times, which would be beneficial in all sorts of ways, not least with the travel of getting there, but that should enable premium pricing so that an island like this maintains its very considerable attractions into the future. Thank you very much.